talk about community life. What did community look like? For those who've watched the movie The Jesus Revolution, it kind of makes everything out to be, a bunch of hippies getting together, chilling out together. But how? I'm sure it was more complex than that. So how did people care for each other and support one another and challenge one another, and all those aspects of community life?
When we first, in the Jesus movement, we were still quite structured, quite a bit more structured. The movie, The Jesus Revolution, I think I'd like to say a couple things about just correcting some opinions. For one thing, Chuck Smith was a great Bible teacher going in. He had been in the denomination I was in, and they had run a Sunday school contest. And his church won it after he refused to join it. In other words, his church grew to where they wanted to give him the trophy, and he got mad and he left the denomination over it because he wasn't into that kind of stuff. He was just teaching the word. And they so offended him by this thing. And so he was working in a Christian school as an administrator, started teaching a Bible study in Costa Mesa. And it was just growing leaps and bounds. And this little church called Calvary Chapel asked him to come be their pastor. They had this gorgeous building. It wasn't at all like the movie. It was a beautiful little building. We'd seat about 350 people. And when I got involved in the Jesus movement, that building that would hold 350 was accommodating a couple thousand people every weekend.
Oh, my.
In multiple services. They knocked out a wall, put in glass, all of that. And so in the movie, Kelsey Grammer, I was thrilled that he came out with his testimony and that he did that movie, but it made him look like a bumbling person going in until, Lonnie Frisbee showed up and all of that. And I felt like that needs to be corrected because Chuck really, and I heard Chuck 2 weeks before we started the church talk about how he did away with, adult Sunday school, all the things that we were doing. And he just taught through the Bible chapter by chapter. And, he would do on a Sunday night, he'd go through 10 chapters in 2 hours. That's a long time to sit. But He's got hundreds of hippies sitting there listening to him. Wow. The floor and the aisles are all full of people. And because they ran out of seats and all that, people are sitting outside looking in the windows. Pretty soon that was our story. Except for I couldn't do 10 chapters. I would do one chapter, one in the New Testament in the morning and one in the Old Testament at night. And so I think that needs to be corrected. The other thing that I felt like is that Lonnie Frisbee was into the things of the Spirit. And the conflict that was there had to do with people falling down in the Spirit, more of the miraculous. Chuck, coming out of the denomination I came out of, was a little bit reactive against excess, what we would see as excess. And there was no conflict over, I'm going to take over the church or I'm rebelling against Chuck, any of that. That needs to really be corrected. And I think another thing that I would just like to add to this is Greg Laurie, who has become a national figure. As a teenage boy, what you see in the movie is Lonnie discipling Greg. Greg designed this little tract, and there was two of them, the little surfer dude cartoon tracts. They made a vast impact on the world, and it was just right in the groove of where we needed to be. And millions of those things were put out. And I, before I ever met Greg, I'm in awe. I'm 28 years old and I'm in awe of this 16-year-old kid who made this track. I want to meet the guy. And it wasn't until years later I was in Hawaii that we actually did meet. But I think the movie was great. I'm really glad it was out there. I think that the three main people that you need to look at are Chuck and Lonnie, and we all know that Lonnie died of AIDS and all of that, but the man was used of God. And then Greg, and I think, thank God for all these people and the influence they've had in my life.
That's such a helpful insight. Very good. I was wanting to ask you about the Holy Spirit. You've already been talking about him quite a bit, but clearly any move of God has a strong dose of the Holy Spirit involved for obvious reasons. So just talk a bit more about how you saw the Spirit at work in people's lives, and kind of how you knew the Spirit was at work amongst you.
Again, coming back to my own youth, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, but it acted like a Baptist church. So I'd go to youth camp and I would meet Pentecostal culture. I would be in church and it was very much like it could be Bill Hybels.
Right.
And there wasn't much of the Spirit. And then in my junior year in high school, they brought in a speaker who, pressed the issue of speaking in tongues and being baptized in the Holy Spirit. And I had an experience with God that was really touching. Mm-hmm. And then I went to the Bible college, and it was part of the mother church, and it was depressing. And I'd seen photographs of 6,000 people in this church, and now there's 400. Ooh. And I was forced to work in their Sunday school because they didn't have any workers. And so, again, very, very, very conflicted and not really knowing what's what. And so on the one hand, I've grown up in the program. On the other hand, I'm hungry for the things of the Spirit. And then on the third hand, I'm looking at the people who represent the things of the Spirit as kind of phony, pushing things, people being pushed over to fall down backwards in the Spirit. And I know those things are real. They've happened. It happened to my wife. It's never happened to me. But on my ordination after the college thing, 7 people came around laying hands on all of us graduates, and 7 pairs of hands, 14 hands pushing on you. I just prayed, Lord, I'm going to put one foot behind the other, just so if I fall down in the Spirit, it'll really be the Spirit. It won't be these guys pushing me. I was the only one left standing out of about 50 people. And so I became cynical. And then what really kind of pried all that open was watching what God was doing at Calvary Chapel and all of the stories of deliverance from drugs and all of that. And then we began to enter into that. So that kind of became the Holy Spirit's tunnel into our lives, that we would pray with people that were strung out on acid, people who had really blown their minds, crazy people, and they'd be sane. And that kind of the Spirit did something fresh in my life, in the lives of several of us who were there, who were a little programming, and that was really what drove the community. And we saw the power of God, and we saw the power of love. We saw that the churches around us weren't very loving. And we were pretty much, come as you are, and work from there.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about how the Hope Chapel movement was birthed. For those, and again, don't assume knowledge. There'll be some folks here watching who don't know anything about Hope Chapel. They might not have even heard of it. So just give us that and a bit of perspective on how it's grown, but also just like particularly the origins of it, because its roots are in the Jesus movement, aren't they? So.
Oh, the roots certainly are in the Jesus movement. Again, back to the story I told earlier, the guy in the Philippines, the missionary in the Philippines that had seen this rapid growth, moved to America. And I brought him to speak in our church. And at this point, we'd started one congregation. So the Hope Chapel movement started with 12 people in Manhattan Beach, California. It ended up the first Sunday.
For those who don't know the area, that's Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, California.
Yeah.
And so, we were told all the stuff that was happening, the good things that were happening. Our denomination said, well, that works at the beach, but that wouldn't work anywhere else. Those kinds of craziness were going on. But we had planted a church. We had some people who lived just the geography of that part of Southern California. They lived about 8 miles from us, but there was no freeway access. It was all surface streets, a lot of stoplights. And they'd come on Sunday morning, but they wouldn't come back to the Sunday night thing because they had little kids and they needed to get them to bed and all that. So they came and said, could we have this guy, Richard Agostino, come and lead a Sunday night church service in a house? And he could teach on whatever you're teaching on, and on Manhattan Beach Boulevard. He could teach it in South Torrance, California. And so we did that. And Rich and I had become really close friends. We were very aware of Dawson Trotman and the Navigators, because we're looking for models. We're looking for what we see as church we don't like. What we saw in the Navigators, we did like. What we saw in Chuck Smith, we did like. So we're young. I mean, we're 28 years old, whatever. And so Rich and I would go to Palos Verdes, California, where Dawson Trotman would sit and pray over the harbor in San Pedro. And we would walk the perimeter of a golf course every Monday morning, meet at 6 o'clock in the morning, get up at 5:30 and walk and pray. And so these guys asked, can Rich come down and lead Sunday night church? And that was all fine. About 8 weeks in, he comes and says they want to become their own church. We want to call it Branch of Hope. So I'm still in the denomination. I'm still wearing a suit. And I go, well, you can't do that, because the denomination says they can only have one of their churches in one town. There's already two in Torrance, so you can't do that. The name you can't use for two reasons. One is the denomination wouldn't let you use that name. The other is we don't want to say Branch of Hope because it looks like we're trying to be a denomination, and we don't want that. And the third was you didn't go to Bible college. Now here I am. I'm influenced by a guy in the Philippines, but the denomination in America says you got to go to the Bible college, and you didn't go to the Bible college, you can't do it. And about 3 or 4 weeks, and he went along with it. About 3 or 4 weeks go by, and I ran into a friend of mine, a guy named Roy Hicks Jr., and he told me, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. Just go do it and tell them that you did it. And so we did. And when I told them that we did it, they loved it. And so that kind of got the ball rolling. Well, the next thing was, because we were making disciples who made disciples, we actually were doing microchurch and not knowing it.
Okay.
And so the denomination comes to us, and they have a building that is empty. Do we have anybody that could become the pastor and start a new church? Because that's what I did. We started a church in an empty church building that had been closed. So we sent somebody there. And the next thing you know, they've got another one that's nearly dead. And we sent somebody there. And that was a mistake, because a nearly dead church will fight back. Right. And they want to preserve what has run them down and not do anything new. And so, but probably the first 12, I was the 30th guy to leave that church 12 years after we started it. When I left to go plant in Hawaii, I was the 30th church planter.
Wow.
But probably out of the first 10 or 12, 5 of them or 6 were the denomination coming to us with an empty building. Mm-hmm. And so we would just kind of look around and go, who's got a big Bible study, or who's got a big NAV group going, because they're a pastor, and they could give, and that got us rolling. And then, we begin to codify things and learn how to do things. And one thing led to another.
And how, just to give you a sense of perspective, how large would you say is the Hope Chapel movement or extended family now?
A number of years ago, I got involved with Exponential, 2016, and they started asking me that question. And I was telling everybody about 1,400 churches. And after I told them that, I began to wake up in the morning, every morning for a while, feeling guilty, like I had exaggerated. There's probably 1,000 churches. They're really only about 80 that I've ever had my fingers in. I know how to raise up pastors who raise up pastors who raise up pastors. And so what I did, though, in response to Exponential, was I went into my Outlook contacts, just Microsoft Outlook, and anybody, because we were a movement, we weren't an organization. We wouldn't let ourselves be an organization. We knew that if I was the president of something, it would slow it down. And so we stayed disorganized, loosely organized. And we're a fellowship. We're not, we didn't even have an annual gathering. Today we would for sure do it by Zoom, but for one thing, it got out of hand and we didn't have a lot of money because we're always investing money in the next church. We don't have money for the ones that already went out the door. But I went through my contacts and I just began to ask, did you change your name? What is your name? Remind me when you started. How many churches have you planted? Can I have their contact? And so I pushed this thing out and I built this big monster, actually a Word document, and I found 2,217 churches.
Wow.
Or 2,117 churches. I can't remember which. And I told Exponential that. Well, by the time I got to the first conference, a couple months later, there were 5 more churches. So I think it was like 2,122 churches or something like that. Anyway, we've still loosely kept track. And by that, what I mean is I published the document that I made to all the pastors that I had talked to.
Right.
But I also, on that mailing list, I had the ones who didn't respond to my survey. So I sent them the survey. So then I get back, why didn't you include my churches? We started 40 churches. And so now we know there's more. And then we've heard of more yet. And, one guy, there were 100 and some churches in East Africa. And I ran into him 3 years ago, and now there's close to 300 churches. So we estimate that it's between 25 and 2,600 congregations in the world. And if you average that out, because some are huge, the biggest church in Hawaii right now is one of our guys, and some are quite small. But if you average them at around 100, you're looking at 250,000 people that are actively in church. And then if you think about all the people who died over the years and went to heaven, there's a lot of folks. And so that's kind of the scope.
Incredible. That's amazing. Wow. That's extraordinary.
I want to add a caveat, though. The difference between us and some other people is that we actually at one point counted. There's a lot of people out there who've made disciples, who've made disciples, who've made disciples, and nobody is applauding them because they didn't take the time to count and make a big deal. I don't think it's as big a deal as other people think it is. I think if, Dave Ferguson once used the term in an exponential event, the Jesus movement, and then he qualified it. He said the original Jesus movement. And it hit me that we don't own this thing that we call the Jesus movement. We almost trademarked it, The movie, The Jesus Revolution, I'm glad it was called The Jesus Revolution because it was a revolution. Yeah. But the Jesus movement started 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
And we just need to sort of humble ourselves and realize we're just a little part in a big thing that God's been doing for a long time.
Totally. I love your humility, Rafa, and when we've talked on different occasions, I've always been struck by it, just how humble and gracious you are. But I just want to honor you for that. That's an incredible way the Lord has used you and your ministry. And 26, 27, it might be 2,900 by the time we finish recording, but that's an extraordinary thing. So, and it's super encouraging. I think it's encouraging for people to hear that God is doing that in our time, in these days, in, supposedly cynical post-Christian West. So that's really cool. A question I jotted down is this, that the Jesus movement especially seemed to impact young people. Now, obviously, we're 50 years on, so we don't want to just carbon copy it. But how would you exhort young believers today? It might be in teens, 20s, whatever, early 30s, but just young people today who are watching you and they're disciples of Jesus, and they hear your talk, or maybe they watch the movie or whatever it is, and they're kind of like, oh, this is cool. What would you say to them? If
I would say several things. First, I like to give a context. There was a book written in 1982 called Generations, and it's the subtitle was The History of America's Future. And they say that the main premise of the book is that every 4 generations from the Puritans, we think of the Puritans as old people wearing black clothes. They were the most well-educated cohort, generational cohort in the history of America. And because they were Oxford and Cambridge graduates who rebelled against the church.
Right.
They tried to purify it. That didn't work. So they moved to the New World to start over.
Mm.
But beginning with that generation, every 4 generations, you see this cycle. And there's these people have written a new book now called The Fourth Turning, which is really worth reading. And they're saying that this aggressive, the baby boom fit the profile of the Puritans. Our attitude when we came up, even before the Jesus movement, was, you people have destroyed the church. We're going to save it. We know what we're doing. You don't. And cocky and arrogant and a little bit stupid, but the Lord worked. The Lord works with whoever is there,
yeah,
to the extent that He can.
Yeah.
And this aggressive nature, we're going to go do something different, kind of freed us up. So what I would be saying to people who are now in the fourth turning, who are young people who are coming up, is go for it. And probably what you're going to need to do has a lot to do with what we're calling microchurch, because the climate, the sociological climate, the political climate is arrayed against you. So seek the Lord, engage the miraculous as much as you can, operate in love toward those who don't like you, and mostly you're going to have to deal with people in the church who don't like what you're doing. And I think that you find your forms, find what forms work in your generation with your people. And I think there's great hope for the world, but I think it because I think that the Holy Spirit is not dead and is going to do a new move. I don't think it because I look at the church in America and think, oh, wonderful things are happening. Because even as I tell the story of Hope Chapel, these days it's a story mostly of other places in the world. That's where it's growing. Where it's kind of slammed to a halt are in the centers of where we did what we did. America, the church in America has changed and is hurting badly, and I pray for it. But I believe that there are those young people, and even Alex, as we're talking, the chances that somebody in the fourth turning is listening to this are pretty slim, because the church has pretty much let them down. And so those rare people who are listening to this, I thank God that you're there, and I'm praying for you.